Lyndon LaRouche, welcome to Election 80.
Thank you.
I'd like to open up with this question, if I may. Leadership is a quality the American people have demanded from their president. Many Americans feel we are not receiving a strong, effective leadership. How would you define leadership?
I'll give two examples in terms of the presidency. Now, I don't want to endorse Franklin Delano Roosevelt's policies, particularly those of the 1930s. But in my view, Roosevelt was the last president who did not rattle around in the Oval Office. I mean, Eisenhower had good points, others had good points. But Roosevelt was the only person who understood how to lead the American people. An example of that is John Kennedy's treatment of the space program. Now, the NASA space program was actually developed pretty much by the Eisenhower administration. But John took a leaf out of FDR's book in saying we have the famous, I think it's been replayed many times, that famous address that we adopted reaching the moon within a specified period of time as a national goal. In point of fact, the NASA program kept our economy alive largely. It was the R&D gut of our economy. It was a great accomplishment. And we have many benefits from it, including the fact that we now have these little computer chips that we can have all kinds of things that we can play with, which are beneficial to us. The function of a leader is not merely to pass laws. Laws are sometimes necessary, but we have an excess of dependence on laws, and passing a lot of laws is a symptom of a weak leader. The way you get things done in anything, and especially government, is the function of a president is to define national goals and to appeal to the national consensus for those goals. And then you find the combination of public and private initiative, but particularly private initiative, will just get the thing done. And that's the way it works. And that's what's been lacking. There's been, people are saying, let's amend the Constitution to this, let's pass this law, let's pass that. Sometimes that's necessary, but in general there's an excess of that. The function of a president is not to pass a lot of laws. The function of a president is to be the instrument of self-government of a people, to provide the kind of leadership that they seek by selecting national goals, which the overwhelming majority of people will get behind, and which private initiative largely will get done, with government supporting that action by private initiative.
You did mention some leaders in your definition of leadership, and I'd like to move into that area, if I may. To help further clarify your perspective of leadership, who would you consider to be three of the most effective leaders in history, and why would you select these people?
Well, working in the 20th century, I mentioned FDR, who I think was an effective leader. And as I'm not endorsing all of his programs. But Charles de Gaulle is probably the most remarkable leader of this figure, even though he's wrongly deprecated in this country, big propaganda against him. De Gaulle did, in the middle of the 1950s, when France was in a grave crisis, he stepped forward and said he had to become the president of France. He had no elected position at the time. He was coming totally from the outside. And he said, here's a crisis, I must step in and lead France out of this crisis. He succeeded. That's how the Fifth Republic was constituted. And France was, well, it still has many shortcomings today, was brought out of this hideous condition which had been wallowing for decades and began to develop around nuclear energy, around its aerospace and a few other things, began to develop. De Gaulle had a conception of France, which is my conception of the United States. The function of a nation is to lead, give that nation a moral purpose in the world. Then the people of the nation, through the nation, are participating in shaping the future of humanity, which is what our Constitution dedicates us to. It's the life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness for ourselves, but more importantly, our posterity, the kind of world we're creating. De Gaulle had that. He understood that. And he was therefore, in my opinion, one of the greatest leaders of the present century. In the last century, I think you have to give outstanding points to Abraham Lincoln. He was undoubtedly the greatest figure. He's deprecated as some sort of a simple-minded fellow. He did have humility, and I think that's necessary in a leader. There's an area which a leader is really an instrument of a higher purpose. Is not some kind of a dictator who has gotten absolute authority. He is the servant of a higher purpose, like a priest or a pope, the same thing. And therefore the leader must be, in a sense, represent and lead in terms of competence, but he must have, at the same time, the humility which reflects the fact that he is the instrument of a higher purpose. He must radiate that, as well as believing that and living from that standpoint. Lincoln had precisely that quality. He saved our nation. He preserved the foundations which the Founding Fathers had attempted to give us, and embedded in our nation an organic impulse that we call the American system, the American way of doing things, which despite many distortions imposed on the top, that up until a recent time, our people have had a special quality we call the American method, the American way of looking at things, which, despite all its perfections, is the best thing there is in the world in terms of a people. And Lincoln was the person who secured and gave us that perspective. I think those are examples of real leaders.
Let's move this into closer to home, if I may. What decisions have you made in the past which best reflect your effectiveness as a leader?
Well, my principal function, apart from being a politician, has been as executive of a international private political intelligence news agency. In that capacity, and also emerging, at least in elite circles of the world, as a leading economist, I'm in daily, weekly contact with government, diplomatic, industrial, financial, military, intelligence circles throughout the world. And as a private individual, I perhaps, for an individual outside the establishment, have probably exerted more influence on the shaping of history in the recent, particularly the past 5 years, than anyone else. In that context, I've had to make many decisions which are really tough. It's when you come up the hard way, that way, is because I built an organization from scratch. And an organization which came out of obscurity and scratch with a few hundred people and then a few more, to build an international organization which is extremely influential. I've dealt with strategic problems. I've probably, and I say this quite modestly, I've probably done more to deter continued Soviet aggressiveness or to moderate that aggressiveness during the past 2 weeks than anyone else in the United States. This requires tough decisions. It requires sometimes doing things that go against the grain of popular prejudice. But you're not being arrogant toward people, even though their prejudices may say that you're doing the wrong thing. You know you're approaching your own people with lovingness. You know what their morality is. You won't violate or betray that morality, though you may do things which they don't understand in the short run. But your starting point is their moral perception of the world, and your end result must be in agreement also with what is morally acceptable to them. I've faced many times that sort of thing.
I'd like to move into the realm of speculation. Today, America is confronted with a crisis situation. Americans are faced with the constant reoccurrence of inflation, recession that happening simultaneously, the rise in unemployment rate, the rise in food prices, the rise in fuel prices. A lot of this seems to have been jettisoned by the energy crisis. These are the kinds of problems that you would be facing if elected president. What would you intend to do about these problems? And please be specific. I've
already done it. It's just a matter of what's required is to have a president in the White House who will cooperate specifically with the European monetary system nations led by France, who is sort of the spokesman, is primus inter pares. It's not French domination of the rest of the EMS. But the other nations expect President Valéry Giscard d'Estaing to be the political spokesman for this policy which I authored, shaped some time ago. Europe is committed to it. It's called the European Monetary System, and there's an adjunct secondary phase which is called the European Monetary Fund. This will represent the establishment of a new goal-based world monetary system. France intends to have this implemented with the cooperation of Germany and other nations by the spring of this year. The problem has been that the Carter administration in particular, Henry Kissinger as well, have been violently opposed to the establishment of a goal-based monetary system. That in itself doesn't solve the problem. What it does is this. It creates a situation in which money lent today will be as valuable in the future when it's repaid as it is today. Under this condition, you can create a system of low interest rates, that is, prime interest rate between 4 and 6% on the international lending markets and in domestic markets. That is required for economic growth. Furthermore, if you have a tightly administered gold reserve system, you've beaten monetary inflation. You haven't beaten cost inflation, but you've beaten monetary inflation. Now, the immediate problem is that monetary inflation is double-digit, whereas cost inflation is probably in the order of magnitude of 1 to 3% per year. So the greater part of our problem is not the cost inflation. It's not government deficits as such. That's not the problem. The problem is monetary inflation. Now, the second thing you have to do, having controlled monetary inflation, you must now deal with cost inflation and with expanding the total product of the nation to meet the growing needs that we have. This means that you've got to have a tax policy and a credit policy which provides cheap credit for those kinds of things, such as capital formation and creating productive jobs in agriculture, manufacturing, construction, mining, and transportation, especially. The things which produce wealth. And so you must have a low interest cost through private banks organized by the federal government to ensure that local banks have this lending power. And secondly, you must have a system of tax incentives, which is twofold. First, we have to raise the household tax exemption from this federal standpoint. Because what we're doing now is we are doing terrible things by taxing too heavily at too low a level of the income brackets. We've got to relieve that. That will take the pressure off state and local communities, which are starved of funds because the households are being taxed too high on the federal level. Secondly, it will enable households to generate savings. Now, these savings, in the form of bank deposits and so forth, by households and by others, through the private banking system, matched with reasonably priced credit, is the basis for national economic growth. If we can grow fast enough, fostering technology with adequate energy supplies and so forth, then the effect of economic growth is to deflate the currency. That is, economic growth causes a rise in productivity, which means that less effort is required by the labor force as a whole to produce the things we need. Therefore, with productivity increases based on economic growth, you can have rising wages and rising profits at the same time, which is the only way you have sound growth. The one thing we have to include in this to make it work is we've got to have nuclear energy. The problem here is not that there's a problem with nuclear energy. There isn't. The problem is that, particularly since about 1969, when Walter Cronkite went on the air with his running out of everything program, is that the public has been inundated with misinformation about nuclear energy, particularly fission energy, to the point that they don't know that we can enforce safety to eliminate that problem. We already have the capability of doing that. We're not doing it, I admit, under the present administration. And we can eliminate radioactive waste by reprocessing, which there's a big myth about that. So there are these two problems with fission process, radioactive waste and safety. Both are technologically under control if we enforce the rules, which we must do. But nuclear energy is the only replacement we have. The so-called alternative energies are cost inefficient. That is, you have to put more energy in and more capital in to produce the energy in many cases than you get out. Solar energy is tremendously inefficient. You have to expend more energy to create solar energy capture than you get out. And it's very low-grade energy, which means it's also very inefficient. The other things are the same problem. So if we commit ourselves to expanding our nuclear energy production, as other nations of the world are doing, and have cheap credit, a revision of our tax policy to foster the kind of capital formation which leads to productive employment, we'll work our way out of the cost inflation problem, and we'll stabilize the monetary system so we will have no recurrence of monetary inflation.
Lyndon LaRouche, thank you for being with us on
Thank you.
Election 80.